Welcome to our lecture on 1970s fashion for our History of Fashion class, Fashion 20. All right, so we're starting off with just some pictures of what's happening. We had Nixon resign due to the Watergate scandal, happening. So a lot of political things with Vietnam and the wars, and a lot of rebellion that we saw from the 60s. And coming from the 60s into the 70s, you started seeing this shift in focus. Remember, in the 50s, we were focusing on family, and we went into this era of rebellion and focusing on youth. And then in the 70s, as it was just a big focus on youth, and we never stopped. That's where marketing, that's where a lot of the product development switched, and they focused on the youth. Fashion, everything else followed when it comes to that. And when you see a lot of the photographs with the rebellion, and let's face it, a lot of the drug use. I mean, look at him. He's high as a kite. You can see it. He's not here. He's somewhere else. And that's why you see a lot of these pictures and their fascination with bubbles and, some of these prints. And you'll see, it makes sense with some of the prints that you see. I don't think you can be sober and create some of those. Let's look at the key looks and groups for the 70s. So overall categories, and we'll look at each one, but boho chic, folk and ethnic, punk and glam rock, safari and military, and they go hand in hand, and androgyny. Key items to look at for the 70s really was earth tones. A lot of earth tones, a lot of tans, a lot of suede. We see a lot of use of suede, a lot of bell-bottom pants, called them flares, a lot of fringe for a lot of movement, very high-waisted designs, really high-waisted for you because now our rise is much lower than what we typically used to see. And maxi, which means longer length, were key items. But we're going to look at the different looks so you can take a look at it and understand what each one composed of. Now, in terms of overall trends, granny dresses, and they just were in season this last spring and going into fall. The granny dresses and the hippie dresses, and we're getting a variation for this spring. So hippie dresses, the mid-calf, and we see maxi length, so going down to the ankle and almost floor length. We did see in the 70s a lot of inspired from the Edwardian era. So we see a lot of use of lace, so a lot of lace trim, and prairie dresses. So a lot of calico, which is like the small little floral print. So it's like cotton, and typically cotton, but it's a plain woven, and it has all these small little flower prints, and then they would add lace to it. So prairie dresses. Shift dresses were popular. Those came from the 60s. So short mott dresses to knee length shirt dresses were popular. So shift dresses came from the 60s. Peasant blouses were really big. Tunics, a lot of like these flowy tunic tops that you would wear over your flared pants. Funny t-shirts. So this is the birth of the verbiage tee. Verbiage meaning like you have a t-shirt and it has like a funny saying on it or an interesting saying. You didn't really have too much of that prior to this. Bell-bottom pants and jeans that we call bell bottoms, but back then they called them flares or loons, but mainly flares. And that was a popular term for those. We call them bell bottoms now, but they were called flares at the time. So those were key trends. Also some homemade and kind of decorated, like DIY. They just didn't call it DIY back then, but homemade, decorated. A lot of that trickle up came from the youth. Fashion adoption started. And a lot of patches, fringe, embroidery, things that you can do at home. Back then, a lot of people knew how to knit and embroider and crochet, and they would teach the kids how to do it. So a lot of the youth did know how to do this, and they would cut suede or leather to create fringe. Pantsuits with silk bow blouses, so the ones that tie on the neck, were popular for the office, for career wear. And blazers became really popular. It started in the 70s. We associated mainly a lot with the 80s, but actually started in the 70s. Jumpsuits galore. My goodness, jumpsuits for both men and women, and they could be worn more casual, and it could be more like dressed up. It could be more like evening, like the disco. Long knit vests layered over tops and pants, very popular for the 70s. And vintage jewelry became popular, jewelry just in general, but it was interesting. jewelry that was a little bit more in the Art Deco movement, so like 1920s jewelry, and it kind of had this revival. So it's interesting when you look at that, is they did use a lot of geometry as well in the 70s. And as you can see in this slide, it's very similar to the 60s with the shift dresses. So, you know, the 60s look kind of continued on. So you had your turtleneck, you had the brightly printed or plaid printed shift dress, and then you had like the colored tights. And on the other picture, you can see the chevron stripe, you know, the zigzag, and you had these geometric looks. So when you really start looking at the details, it's not too surprising when you see that the 1920s Art Deco jewelry kind of came back. We call it flower power, right? Be flower child. A lot of these pictures, but a lot of the daisies in particular, a lot of the pretty flowers, feminine looks, really funky tights with shimmer and different kind of finishes, really short hemlines, really showing off the legs. And I gave you a link to a video that basically goes through, it's a really short video, it's like under 3 minutes, so please take a look at it, but it goes through all like very main big trends. So it goes into like the jumpsuits for both men and women, platform shoes, flares, you know, the bell bottoms. So it goes through the main trends, so take a look at this video, it's really good. And that's important because if you ever get a project where they're like, okay, I wanted very 70s look, that they expect you to know what that means, even if you didn't live through that era, right? So they'll expect those kind of main trends to be hit. So platform shoes, jumpsuits, bell bottoms, you know, the hippie, you know, or bohemian look. Overall categories and groupings, hippie and boho chic. So really important that you actually understand the difference. There are people that use these two groupings interchangeably. Like they're interchangeable, they mean the same thing. They don't. They don't mean the same thing. There is a difference between the overall hippie look and the bohemian chic. So make sure that you do understand the difference. Now, look at these two slides. This has a much more softer material, softer color, floral, and look at the previous one. Okay, so you have lace, but dark lace. You have kind of this juxtaposition, as you can see in her hair, and performers had this. So the hippie had a less softer look. Bohemian is more florals and more closer to nature, whereas hippie was a juxtaposition of color, of prints, and had a more kind of wilder look to it, whereas bohemian is softer. So this is hippie. This is more out there. This has a mixture of prints. It had more volume, whereas bohemian chic is very more softer, more closer to earth, and had a more relaxed vibe. Okay, so there are differences between hippie and boho chic. It's just, let's face it, a lot of people do bunch them up together. It basically means more flowy, some florals, juxtaposition of certain prints, but just like these long flowy sleeves, often longer lengths, and it has this kind of, yeah, very kind of prairie hippie-ish, hippie with bohemian chic flower girl. It's kind of all over the place, so people kind of mesh them all together, but just know bohemian is more floral, more feminine and softer versus hippie. Hippie is more louder colors and more juxtaposition. In terms of folk and ethnic, so big obsession with ethnic details. So like a lot of beading, a lot of fringe, a lot of usage of leather, particularly suede, with contrast whip stitching, a lot of usage of bone, and a lot of hanging jewelry, feathers, a lot of use of feathers and tie. So that was like this big obsession with that. These prints, in particular like African prints, and you can see a lot of this mixture of color and these kind of overall random prints or repeat prints, a lot of lace slashing and lacing and tying. Going back to that, again, using a lot of these colors that were really predominant in like African fabrics, so a lot of like the oranges and the golds and these interesting patterns. And famous people really helped bring that to be popular. Cher was one of them. She loved some of these interesting prints, so she was really big on that. So and the fringe, so she helped popularize that, no doubt. Punk and glam rock, a lot of people think that's strictly 80s, started in the 70s actually. So obviously with the glam look, it's, you know, started with David Bowie and some of these other, the glam rock bands, and then went into punk. And it was interesting. Some were like, I'm not looking like that. They went kind of rebelling against that, and they went all out. I mean, a lot of spike studs, a lot of writing on their jackets, as you can see, and trying to look as intimidating, a lot of piercings, and to look as intimidating as you possibly could. A lot of safety pins, slashing things, bleaching, ripping. And that was a revolt to this, which was the glam again. And Marie and Donnie, the siblings that were the Osmonds. So it's like, they have the glitter and the fringe, the dip dyed glitter, the fringe. And so one thing to understand was interesting is oftentimes those hemlines in the 70s were really short. Women wanted to show off their legs. The shorter the better. So it would be what Michael Kors would say about Heidi Klum, that her skirts were really short. They were fallopian length, because you can practically see her fallopian tubes. He was trying to be funny. And so we would say 70s had hemlines that were fallopian length, really short hemlines. So a lot of women didn't want to wear the pants. However, those that did, in particular with career wear, they would wear their pants, and it was an important component from the late 60s. The pantsuit really was, now some of them really funky prints, but pantsuit was an important component, especially as they were going into business and going into corporate level jobs. And what's interesting, very menswear inspired, and basically the feminine details were more around the neck, with string of pearls, brooches, like tying of the bow and around the neck was very feminine. The Charlie's Angels era really kind of bring girl power and women, strong women. And that brought into the 70s kind of androgyny. So when we think of androgynous unisex look, it didn't start now. It's been around. And 70s was really big on that, as you can see with these styles that would work the same for men and women. Safari, obsessed with the safari look again. It always comes in and out every decade, and the 70s is no exception to that with the capes. And that tends to go hand in hand. Typically when the safari look comes in, the military look comes in as well. In the 70s, because of all the things going on politically and with overseas relations, then yes, very big on military inspired, and people protesting against the Vietnam War and other things that were happening. So as you can see here with John Lennon and Yoko Ono. So popular to see kind of these kind of styles, especially those that wanted to be more vocal. For evening wear for women, bias cut came back to be really popular. So all of a sudden, like these long gowns, because they were really short from the 60s. Evening wear was short in the 60s, and when the 70s came, it started going into long and bias cuts. So really long and kind of flowy bias cuts. And that kind of brought in also that long look for the daytime dresses as well. But evening, very popular. Something to note, most cloth coats were fitted short, but there was puffy, the downfill coats. It did have a moment in the 70s, but it was a fad. It didn't last too long, but it kind of came really strong. I mean, it was like huge, and then it was like gone. So it was a fad. It didn't. And in terms of typical hair and headdresses, hats, short hair, shag, short waves, in particular mid-70s to going into the 80s, the wave short was really popular. Mid-70s, the shaggy short haircut, the shag was really popular with some hats. So hats were really popular. And these styles were popular as well in the 60s and going right into the early 80s. Platforms became really popular. So the 70s introduced the platform. So having wooden platforms, and you have a platform where your feet are, the ball of the foot, as well as the heel. And you had contrast colors and buckles, really interesting insoles with interesting colors, very psychedelic colors. Bags with fringe and needlepoint designs were popular. Jewelry of different kinds, and again, the Art Deco kind of came back. Hoops were really popular. Sunglasses in different colors was really popular as well. Okay, so this concludes our part 1. Thanks for listening.